Welcome back. This module is about conversations that inspire us to change, to learn, to adapt. We often refer to it as coaching with compassion, and I'll explain a little more about why in a moment. And again, as I said at the introduction, the exercises are very important because if it's just the thoughts, you could read them. But the whole point of taking the course is to start to wrestle with the experiences, and it's the emotional part of it that has the more lasting impact on your learning. So please join us in the exercises. Now, the theme of today is this module is building on something we talked about in the last module, that we need the positive emotional attractor to thrive, but we need the negative emotional attractor to survive. And survival is a key part of the ecological sustainability of each of us as a person, of our families, of our teams, of our agencies, of our organizations, of our communities. So we need the negative emotional attractor. We need moments of stress. But very often those go on too long, or they're too strong, and they overwhelm us, as we talked about in an earlier module, and it leads us to start to close down and become somewhat impaired cognitively, perceptually, and emotionally, less open to new ideas, less open to other people. So part of what we're trying to do is, how do we invoke this positive emotional attractor more often? How do we help, using the language of complexity theory I alluded to in the last module, how do we create a tipping point or trigger point from pulling somebody back from the negative emotional attractor, this state, into the positive? How do we help somebody return to it or stay in it more frequently? And that's really what we're calling coaching with compassion. Because compassion is an experience, a state in which we are in the positive emotional attractor. The difference is, very often when we try to help people, as we described briefly in the last module, we do what we call coaching for compliance. We try to help somebody figure out what they're supposed to do to change to fit into our view of what they should be or how they should act. When we are engaged in coaching for compliance, we're actually doing more revenge-driven work than trying to help somebody develop. Because as soon as you go into that mode, the person defends themselves, they go into a negative emotional attractor, sympathetic nervous system, and they start to close down. So how do we know this works? Well, for the better part of 25 years, we've been studying this process at Case Western Reserve University, and we've been collecting data that as soon as you give people data feedback, remember I talked about this in the last module, they go into a sympathetic nervous system arousal. They go into the NEA and start to protect themselves. Even though they might say, well, I should do this, but even the use of the word should very often invokes a sense of obligation, which puts you in the negative emotional attractor. So we are contending that on the basis of all these years, now several decades of longitudinal research, that the issue of engaging people's vision, their ideal self, hope, compassion, because compassion invokes the positive emotional attractor, and mindfulness, thinking about core values, ways of being present, awake and aware, that we can help people in the change process. We can help people consider change. What I'd like to do right now is an exercise. I'd like you to think about and to start to write down on a piece of paper a number of the things that people have said to you over the past few years, bosses, spouses, of things you should change to be better, to be more effective. Things that either you're not doing or you should do less of. They may be things that you acknowledge are important, or they may be things that you just don't see as that relevant or that critical, but nonetheless they do because people have repeatedly brought them up. Whether these are changes in your behavior or your attitudes. I'd like you to make a list of them. And then if you were sitting watching this with any other person, turn to them and briefly talk about it. But if you aren't, just make the list and think about it. I'll ask you to hit the pause button and to work on the list, and then when you're ready, hit the play button. As you were going through this reflection and making this list, again, a chance to practice a little bit of mindfulness. How did it feel? What's going on inside of you? Because this ends up being an important part of your ability to monitor what's happening inside. Remember, in the earlier module, we talked about how critical it was for you to be aware of what's happening inside because of the speed of emotional contagion. So think about how this felt. I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up making you feel a sense of obligation, a sense of, oh, I really have to get to that. You know, it's like your doctor telling you to eat less and exercise more. It's all of these things that people keep saying to you, and as you get older, you might use other words to say, well, they're harping on you, or they're nagging, or they're picking on you. But the fact is that the impact on us is the same at any age. We don't feel very good about it. We don't feel very good about ourselves. And in the process, we're slipping into the negative emotional attractor. Now, for a contrast exercise, I'd like you to think about, and again, I'm going to give you the instruction and ask you to hit the pause button. I'd like you to think about the moments in your life in which you were at your best, the moments in which you felt the most proud of what you were doing or how you were being. I'd like you to think of 3 or 4 moments. And again, on a piece of paper, it helps to write down a few words about each of those moments. When you felt at your best, when you felt proud of what you were doing or how you were acting or the kind of person you were being. Remember a few of those. Hit the pause button right now and then come back when you're ready to reflect on them. Now, in a parallel to the earlier exercise, I'd like you to reflect right now on how it felt when you were remembering these moments, when you were writing these things down. I wouldn't be surprised if you said a smile came to your face. You know, you sat up a little straighter. You felt, yes, you know, life is good. And many of the same kinds of feelings we talked about in the earlier exercises associated with the positive emotional attractor. You start to feel a little bit of a lift of what I would call efficacy, your potency, your ability to engage in something. You felt good about yourself. These two experiences, in contrast, are moments in the negative emotional attractor and the positive emotional attractor. As we've been saying, you need to be in both. And you need to move back and forth to have true, sustained, desired change. But because the negative attractor is so potent, we need you to practice bringing yourself and other people that you're conversing with into the positive emotional attractor. Because my experience clinically is that people bring themselves into the negative attractor all the time. And there are a lot of things in our environment that do that on a regular basis. So what I'm going to do for the assignment from this module is to ask you to practice a conversation that might inspire someone, to practice coaching with compassion. Now, if coaching sounds too big of a thing and you don't want to think about it as coaching, then just think of it as a conversation. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to practice not trying to help someone. I want you to practice bringing someone into the positive emotional attractor and trying to keep them there. Now, remember, that's not the whole process. But it is the part that we slip out of practice with. And that's the one that I think an action learning assignment might help.